I saw on a Facebook forum this week, some like Presbyterian minister forum, someone was like, what's the value of being a church member beyond being able to vote in elections? And I was like, having a decent funeral. So, if you need to join, I'm okay with it if it's just to have a decent funeral. That seems like a good reason to me. Our second reading today comes from John chapter 21, verses 15 through 19. This is a text that we usually read around Easter time when we talk about the resurrection appearance of Jesus. This passage comes as Jesus has been appearing to disciples in different ways and in different places. And in this story, he's shown up at the beach. And his disciples have been fishing and they can't catch any fish. And they're sitting on the beach and Jesus shows up. And they don't recognize him at first, but then they hear his voice and they do recognize him. So today's story is set with Jesus and the disciples sitting around a charcoal fire cooking fish on the beach. You can follow along on page 116 in the New Testament of your pew Bibles if you'd like. John 21, verses 15 through 19. When they had finished When they had finished breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." A second time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He said to him, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Tend my sheep." He said to him the third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter felt hurt because he'd said to him the third time, "Do you love me?" And he said to him, "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. Very truly, I tell you, when you were younger, you used to fasten your own belt and go wherever you wished. But when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will fasten a belt around you and take you where you do not wish to go." He said this to indicate the kind of death by which he would glorify God. After this, he said to him, "Follow me." This is the word of the Lord. Please pray with me. God, I ask that the meditation of our minds and the words of my lips would be holy and acceptable to you this day, and might be for us a word, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. November is the time in the church year when traditionally we talk about money. In church, when we talk about money, we often refer to it as stewardship. Has anybody heard that phrase? Stewardship is the church word for talking about money, the practice of giving and taking care of funds for the maintenance of the church and the things that the church does. Whether at home or at church, conversations about money are, for almost all of us, uncomfortable and complicated. We are taught from an early age that talking about money is a no-no. Did anybody learn that? Yeah. For almost everyone, there can be some level of shame or guilt or ick around money. Maybe you spend too much, or you feel like you don't save enough. Or maybe you just don't make enough, and you need help making ends meet by the end of the month. Maybe you are or have been someone who has had to choose between paying for electricity or gas or water or food. Or maybe you have debt. Consumer debt, that kind that so many of us find ourselves with after those months of trying to make ends meet or trying to help take care of others. Credit card debt, Cash App debt. It can leave us feeling like we are in a hole we will never climb out of. Whether you make a little or make a lot, have less than nothing or more than you could ever need, money for all of us is complicated and fraught. In part because it can and often does divide us. The haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor, those who pay taxes, and those who receive benefits paid for by tax dollars. Talking about money is complicated. We bring to it our childhood trauma and childhood baggage. I can tell you with almost certainty that your parents' feelings and fears about money color your own. The topic of money is hard to separate from our feelings and fears. Those with it fear losing it, and those without it fear losing it too. And our politicians don't make having real conversations about money any easier. They weaponize money and taxes and benefits to sow more fear and anxiety. For some, the threat of taxes is as terrifying as the threat of losing benefits that are provided by the government is for others. Money is hard to talk about, especially for me, your pastor, and especially publicly. It's hard to talk about money because some of us have it and some of us don't. Some of us don't think about money and some of us can't think about anything else. Some of us have never had to worry about how to pay a bill, and some of us don't know how we will feed our children this week. I have an especially weird job because I know. I know who is doing okay, or at least who seems like they're doing okay, and who is not. And because it's November, I have to try and convince you all to give your money to the church so that I can get paid and the lights can stay on and we can have heat and air conditioning and an organist and choir and manna. It's my job to convince you to give some of your money to the church so that we can have food for manna and vans for tutoring and a space for AA and NA and money to help the poor when they need it. Because of the very generous giving of people in this church and some people who came before and have died, I have the great privilege of making a decent living and having health care. And I have the greatest job in the entire world. Just this week, yesterday, I got to marry a young couple. We came early, so you don't see all the candles that were out. But I have the great privilege of getting to marry people and start their lives together. Last week, I was celebrating with another couple that I'll marry soon, and I drank too many margaritas. I have the greatest job ever. I get to pray with people who are suffering from addiction and share pizza with kids and parents before they go out trick-or-treating. This week, I got to listen to the organ as it got worked on, and I guess it now has a foul note. I got to pray at City Council and preside at our monthly session meeting, where we talk every month about money. In the past 2 weeks, I got to preside at a funeral and help a family say goodbye to a loved one. I got to talk with a young mother who was worried about her son, who uses a nebulizer each morning before school. She came here worried because her electricity was being cut off. On behalf of this congregation, I got to try and help make her suffering a little less awful. I got to serve manna, and I got to attend a community resource meeting about how we are going to try and help all of the people who are affected by the government shutdown. In the last 2 weeks, I also got to drive someone who was worried about an insurance bill and whether they could afford to go to the hospital. I got to drive them to OU Medical. I got to sit with them as they found out that they have cancer and need a surgery that they cannot afford. I got to look with her and others this week at the cost of health care for the next year, to see if there was a plan she might be able to afford that would allow her to have the surgery she needs in order to save her life. I have the greatest job in the entire world. And what makes it The greatest job in the world is that I get to hear and know your stories. I get to know who needs help, and when possible, I get to try and help where I can. It's November, so it's the time of year when I'm supposed to talk about money and why the church needs money. That is part of my job, and it's how I get paid. But it's November, and there's a government shutdown. There are at least 1,400 GS employees at Vance Air Force Base who haven't received a paycheck in more than 35 days. There are more than 10,000 people living in Garfield County who rely on SNAP benefits or food stamps who aren't going to get their food stamps this month. Not on time, not in full. There are young mothers in our community who don't know how they're going to pay for diapers and daycare, if they're lucky enough to even find daycare. It makes it kind of hard to find work if you don't have daycare. There are other women and children in our community who've left abusive relationships and who rely on these programs provided by the government, who are just trying to make it on their own. It's November, and it's going to get cold. And some people still can't afford the electricity bills they have from the summer when it was hot and they needed air conditioning and a refrigerator to keep the milk cold. It's November, and it's going to get cold, and now they have to figure out how they will pay for gas to heat their houses, to keep their children warm at night this winter. It's November. So it's a time of year when people have to decide whether they'll have health insurance, and if so, which plan they'll choose. It's November. So people are trying to decide which bets to take on their health for the coming year. It's November, and there's a government shutdown, and it's also stewardship season in the church. And every day I hear wild misinformation about money and government and churches, misinformation that's meant to divide us. And I'm a pastor. I have the greatest job in the entire world because my job is to hear your stories, and my job is to try and help where I can and bring us all together. It's my job to help remind us what makes us the same. So this morning, I thought I'd talk a little bit about money. Because after all, we all, whether we have too much or not enough, struggle with the same things. We all, whether we have too much or not enough, pray that we can take care of our children and pray that we grow old enough that our children will need to take care of us. We all, whether we have too much or too little, we all worship the same God who created us out of nothing and commands us to love one another and to feed his sheep. It's November, so I need to tell you that the church does need money. And if you have some extra money, then hey, we will take it. It's how those of us who work here get paid, but it's also how we keep the lights on and the building warm and the people who come to us for help. It's how we help them. But I also want to complicate some of the things I've been hearing about money and government and church. I want to tell you, if I can, why you should pay your taxes. I know. If you're one of those lucky people in an income bracket who pays taxes, who gets to pay taxes. And why? If you need help and are eligible for help from the government, you should take it. Because actually, the story of those two things, giving to the church and giving to the government, and in turn giving to those in need, taking care of the poor, those things share a history. And it's one that I think every once in a while we should remember. So here goes. Here's your little history lecture. There's no Sunday school, so I have unended time. Just kidding. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Jesus. Have you heard of him? Okay, I wish I had like rewind music to go. We actually need to rewind from Jesus. Once upon a time, there was a guy named Moses. Moses lived in a place called Egypt. His people were very poor. They had to work very hard all day in terrible conditions, and they were not paid enough. They didn't have health care or workers' rights, and they did not earn a living wage. Moses' people were slaves in the land of Egypt. And they worked for a king whom we call Pharaoh. Pharaoh had lots of money. Well, he had gold and stuff and lots of power. But because he could, he treated the people of Israel, Moses' people, terribly. Long story short, Moses helped his people escape. And with the help of their God, whom they called Adonai, they were able to flee east. That's actually east. They went this way, but in my head it's this way because I look at the map. They fled east, and when they got east, God gave Moses some laws that he wanted Moses' people to follow. It was sort of like, hey guys, remember that time I saved you? Cool. Now you owe me. Here's how you can pay me back. Follow these laws. Those laws included laws about taking care of each other. Basically, God told them that they should remember that they had been poor, that they had been hungry, that they had been foreigners in another people's lands, that they had been slaves in the land of Egypt. God wanted them to remember that. And he wanted them to take care of people who were poor or hungry or foreigners. He wanted them to really take care of each other, of all people, economically. Okay, y'all with me so far? Okay, good. This is like a little Sunday school review. Anyway, time goes on. People do what people do. They get greedy. They forget the laws. They forget to take care of each other. You end up with people who are very rich and people who are very poor. There are wars. There are famine. It's history, right? And then, fast back forward, there's a guy named Jesus. Have you all heard of Jesus? Okay, Jesus did not look like the guy in the back window. That is a lovely, unhistorical representation of him. Jesus, the guy we read about, the guy we just read about, he is poor. He's born into a super poor family. Actually, his mom is an unmarried teenager. And we all know that's a recipe for poverty. Right, Faye? Yep, we talk about this a lot. Jesus has an unwed mother, and his dad works in the trades. So they get by, but they are not rich. And Jesus, he ends up starting a movement. It's a movement based on Moses' laws, but focused once again on helping each other, taking care of the poor, the hungry, the widow, the orphan, the imprisoned, the foreigner. All the people who he thinks have been overlooked by the rich and powerful and politicians of his time. Anyway, as you know, Jesus ends up causing a lot of problems with the rich people. They're not happy about his little movement because he's going around saying that people should give away their money and follow him. He's saying that the rich and powerful, the people who hold political power and wealth and are making money off of their political power and wealth, should be sharing their money and their power with the poor people. I doubt he had the same accent, but I like to imagine him like his Jewish brother Bernie Sanders saying, "The millionaires and billionaires." I don't think Jesus did say it that way, but in my head. Okay, so Jesus dies, but right before he dies, he gives a speech about how you can care for him by caring for each other. And he kind of warns that if you don't, it's going to be hot. And that's the speech we read from Matthew 25. And then he's raised from the dead. He meets up with his friends at the beach and he tells them, "Feed my sheep." Jesus, like Adonai and Moses, is all about taking care of one another. So understandably, after Jesus dies and is resurrected and then ascends into heaven, which is part of the story we do not have time for, there's a movement of Jesus's followers who start to meet and hang out and try to live out the things that Jesus told them to do. They start worshiping together and living together and working together and eating together, and they share all of their resources. It's people who are pretty well off and people who are completely broke, hanging out, sharing everything they have, like they are literally living as hippies, okay? Commune type deal. They probably smelled like patchouli. And these people end up calling themselves Christians. And things change and evolve over time, but eventually that movement morphs into what we all call the church. And for thousands of years, these Christians, organized within the structure called the church, they continue to do the things Jesus had been doing and we've always been doing. They care for the poor and they take care of widows and orphans and foreigners and all that. Starting in the 500s, it becomes required for anyone living within Christendom to pay 10% of their income to the church. The Old English word for this is tithe, a tenth. And that tenth of everyone's income that's collected by the church is used to fund programs of the church. Programs for the least of these, feeding my sheep. Before and during and after the Reformation, that money was used by monks and nuns and priests and deacons and ministers and pastors to help provide education, to run schools and hospitals and orphanages and food pantries. Occasionally, like during the Crusades, it was used to wage war or fight off invading groups. It was also often used to fund building projects and pay laborers and artists. Those cathedrals in Europe didn't get built by themselves. Throughout Europe, there has almost always been a welfare state and jobs programs and military, and for eons, it was administered by the church through a tax or a tithe of 10%. And if you go on Wikipedia, you can read these really interesting articles about how even today in Europe, in many European countries, there is still a tax called a church tax, which, among other things, goes to maintain churches and provide funerals. We've come full circle. Got to be part of a church to have a decent funeral. Not really, but it helps. But in America, when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they decided to separate church and state. And when they did, they abolished church taxes. Many of the colonies had church taxes, and colonists paid a tithe. It made sure that you could have things like healthcare, whatever that looked like in those days, food security, education, an educated minister to marry and bury you. But the separation of church and state changed things. Churches kept providing for the poor. Christians still had orphanages and soup lines and hospitals and schools, just as they had in Europe. But it changed. A lot of the way it worked in Europe was possible because people went to church by parish or region. In the old days, and still in some places like South Chicago, when you went to church, you went to the church you could walk to. My husband, his family talks about their parish. They go to the church closest to their house. And if you were part of a parish, then I, as your priest, would know what you needed. I'd know who needed food and who needed help with electricity and who needed diapers. And because everyone would have given 10% of their income, I would use that money to try and meet those needs. But we would be sort of regionally defined who went to our church. But over time in the Americas, as Protestant groups kept splintering and people moved away from parishes and churches became separate from the state, it became necessary to develop a welfare program administered not by the church, but by the government. Because even though we have a separation of church and state, we still need to care for the least of these. We still need to feed his sheep. We are, as everyone loves to say, in fact, a Christian country, which means as a country, we are responsible for living out the gospel and caring for people, whether they read the Bible the same way we do or not. We are a country founded on the ideals of loving one another, helping one another, being a brother to one another. And that means, even though we don't make you go to church in your little neighborhood, and we don't make you give 10% to the church, we still have to care for one another. We still have to feed his sheep and care for the least of these. We do that well as a church. We do that well for the people that we know who come to this church. But there are people who don't come to this church or don't maybe go to any church who also have need. They have children to feed, electricity bills to pay, gas for heat that they need to provide. They need diapers and wipes and formula and all of the things that children need when they're very little. They need an education system that can provide a decent education for their children so that someday they might grow up and be able to read the Bible. These are things that our government helps us provide. Because I can tell you what, we are not equipped to go back to the times when we provided all of that. This week, as I was thinking about all of our neighbors in crisis, the ones we know about and the ones so often we don't know about, I thought about all the people who come and share their stories with me. Stories of hunger and hurt and hopelessness. Stories of fear and feeling forgotten. And I thought we have to talk about how this interfaces with our Christian faith. It is easy for all of us, especially me as a minister, to not want to pay our taxes. I don't want to give Caesar any more than Caesar is due. But it's just as easy to look around and remember that there are people who are hungry, people who are homeless or about to be, people who are worried about how they're going to make sure their kid has their nebulizer before school. And if we don't do our part to help provide that social safety net, who will? If you are a person who has the opportunity to help, please do. Pay your dang taxes. Throw a little money in the plate when it goes by. And if you are a person who needs help that we all have set up to be administrated through government agencies, please take the help. Sign up for the SNAP benefits. I pray they get to you in an expedient fashion and at levels that actually help. Utilize Medicare and Medicaid benefits. Sign up for Sooner Care. Use the dental benefits you get through Sooner Care to get your teeth cleaned before you need emergency services that aren't covered. We set those benefits up to care for you. And someday when you don't need it, maybe you'll be able to care for someone else. It's November and the government's shut down. And there's a lot of people in our community who are without work, without money, without food. It's November and it's time for us to talk about stewardship and how we care for the least of these by giving here and to other organizations and to Caesar. So this week, I invite you to consider where you are in that. Whether you have much to use to bless others or you need a little blessing. Remember that we are all his sheep, and we have to feed each other. Amen.